Welcome to the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. I'm Kevin C. Neese, and I'm flying solo this week, but I have with me as my very special guest, author, activist, and historian, Blair Imani. Blair is also a huge Star Trek fan, and she's going to be talking with us about a lot of cool stuff as we explore the intersection of her Muslim faith with Star Trek. Right here on episode 31, Blair Imani beams in. Stay with us. All right, well, this is it. We are wrapping up Women's Future History Month, and there are few people I can think of I would rather talk to about this than my guest today, Blair Imani. Blair is a critically acclaimed historian, social activist, public speaker, educator, and influencer. She is the author of 2 historical books. The New York Times praises Blair Imani's unique brand, combining progressive lessons with vibrant visuals and a perky, quirky delivery. Her work centers on women and girls, global Black communities, and the LGBTQ community. Please welcome to the show, Blair Imani. Welcome.
Hey, thank you so much for having me. I absolutely love Star Trek. Got me through some tough times, got me through some great times. Can't wait to talk about it.
That's exciting. I'm so cool. And I am really excited to help you rescue your reputation as a nerd here today.
Thank you. It's troubling, you know. Now everybody thinks I'm cool. I'm on the internet. I have like Gen Z, millennials, Gen X, and everybody else thinking that I'm just the coolest thing ever. And I'm like, no, I'm a nerd. I'm an outcast. Give me back my identity.
Oh, that's beautiful. That's beautiful. Yeah, I'll talk to people from like, you know, the previous generation of Trekkies who are like, yeah, we were, you know, nerds back then and it wasn't cool. I was like, it wasn't cool when I was a kid either, sir. But yeah, it's and that's kind of the thing. Like it's now cool to be a nerd, and you're like, but wait a minute. But nerding is still nerdy, so you know, yeah. Tell me a little bit about your relationship to Star Trek and why we're here.
So yes, okay. I mean, my first entry into Star Trek was mostly just through like my older cousins, my uncle. He was more into Battlestar Galactica than he was into Star Trek, so we'll forgive him for that.
Yeah.
But I think Star Trek was just really interesting to me because it was always referenced. I mean, whether it was watching Futurama, whether it was seeing it like just casually on TV, it just had a really interesting story behind it. And I really enjoyed the fact that I just enjoyed the fact that there was so much diversity in it. I mean, like, think about Gene Roddenberry's infinite diversity in infinite combinations. Like, that at its core is so powerful. And then, as a historian, there's a crossover with Star Trek and actual, like, Black history with the first interracial kiss, with Dr. King being a fan of Star Trek. Like, so many deep cuts into Black history. But I particularly identify with Geordi LaForge for multiple reasons. Someone who I feel deserves a spinoff more than anybody.
Oh, yes.
So I'm going to keep campaigning for that until, you know, the dogs come home. But Star Trek was just a way to escape, but also a way to see Black people in the future, and I think that's such a rare occurrence.
Yeah, it is, and particularly, you know, at that time, you know, as you and I were growing up, and even before, and especially before our time, you know, gosh, I think it was week before last, we had the production team from the documentary film Woman in Motion on here, and you know, we talked a lot about that crossover. Especially the film details Nichelle Nichols. I don't know if you're aware of it. Details Nichelle Nichols' work with NASA, and how that her work with Star Trek is often talked about how inspirational her appearance on Star Trek is. But then also that led into her actively working to change NASA to make it look more like, you know, a real life Star Trek. And I think,
absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's the really interesting thing where Black folks in pop culture will be put on a pedestal, but as soon as we try to affect change in the real world, then we're, you know, told to be put in our place. And so I think that what Nichelle Nichols did isn't so much an exception, but is very much what we see consistently in different spaces. I mean, thinking about even things like Nike being a fixture in the Black community because the Black community made it that way, because the Black community has, elevated these things. And then it being forever and a day before they start to really recognize, oh, maybe we should stand up for racial justice. Maybe we should stop trying to attract the lowest common denominator of society and actually stand for something. And so I think that these things are increasingly common, but Star Trek has been out here. Like, people try to say that Star Trek isn't political. It's like, I'm sorry, have you not seen all of the different series?
Right. But it does so in a way that isn't hot. Well, it has been hot button at times for at least the people who could catch the message, right? But it also speaks, I think, very broadly, to things that have political context or political implications from a general human perspective. And it's talking about the kind of human community we want to make. And that, I think, that's what allows it then for me to see that reflected with my Christian faith, because that's very much what we're about, right?
Absolutely. And I think, because it's taking place in the future, the writers can get away with so much that might not be amenable to what folks want to hear in everyday life. But the fact that in 1988 they came out with an episode called Symbiosis, which talked about drug addiction, right at the precipice of the crack epidemic, that is really revolutionary. And being able to convey these messages to people in a way that doesn't get their racial bias turning them into, unseeing eyes is really powerful. And it's just a consistent showing up of creative works in order to make the political less abstract, less scary, and less full of bias and fear, and just get to the heart of the matter, which is, needing a better, more comprehensive view of humanity. Having
a conversation instead of a confrontation.
Oh, yes.
This is what I talk about a lot in my work. And it's, let me see if I can put a name on it. Loving our neighbors.
There was a great guy, I think his name started with a J, who talked about that. It's some interesting stuff.
Yeah. I should look that up. I should try to figure out who that was. Right, yeah. No, I agree. And one of the things that's interesting to me is how we can continue, in nerd culture, right, to carry on the conversation and try to have application, much in the way Nichelle did, in terms of that inclusivity and that diversity, in our subculture. And one of the symbols of that sticks out to me is you. And people
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. People might not recognize this or realize it, but you might have seen a picture a while back of a person in a Geordi LaForge style cosplay with a hijab on. It got a lot of notice. In fact, StarTrek.com even did a video. We'll link to it in the description. A video about you and your cosplay. Tell me about how that came about.
Absolutely. So the thing is that I didn't anticipate having it documented to such a degree, but my dear friend Kaylin Borowski, who's my photographer for all things Instagram, this was before I had really popped off and become, an Instagram influencer. He was like, Blair, you put so much work into this. You should really have some pictures taken. And I was like, Kaylin, do you want to take the pictures? And he did. And it just spiraled out of control. I mean, it just went super viral. I posted it on Friday, which is the holy day in Islam. It's Juma. And it was just really awesome because I was like, Juma Mubarak to Muslims in this dimension and beyond, or something like that. Yeah. And it was just something lighthearted and fun. And I had actually, the other side of it that people don't honestly know about is that I was going through a lot. My mentor had just been killed. My mentor, Miss Sadie Roberts Joseph, she was found, in the trunk of a vehicle, and she had been killed by a man that she was renting her, apartments to. And I found that out from Twitter. And I went immediately into a deep disassociative state that involves Star Trek. And that helped me get through so much of the pain because I could literally look at myself in the future and get away from that feeling of, I can't go anywhere from here. There's nothing left. And feeling afraid, to looking at infinite possibilities. And so I poured my creative self into this cosplay just in time for, San Diego Comic-Con. I think it was like the 50th anniversary or something super momentous.
Yeah, it was.
And it was just so well received. And so my best friend Ren came with me down to San Diego. We sang Elton John all the way down. We stayed at the like horse racing track. And it was a great way to just escape those feelings of, immobility. Like you couldn't do anything. You couldn't go anywhere. You couldn't mourn. You couldn't be there with her family, or, that last conversation I couldn't have with her. And it just let me get into my creative space. And I went to Star Trek Las Vegas after that. But so on the front side of it, people are just seeing this fun image, and it's resonating with folks. But it's always been so clear to me that Geordi LaForge is born in Mogadishu, Somalia, in I believe 2335. What's going to happen between now and 2335 where there's not going to be any Muslims in this Muslim majority country?
Right.
Nothing. And so come on, y'all. Like, there's definitely Muslims in space. There's definitely Muslims in Mogadishu, Somalia. So not only is Geordi LaForge a black Muslim who is also disabled, I would say that a lot of the ways he interacts with, the fair sex tends to be a little bit queer as well. So I felt very much, at home within the cosplay of Geordi LaForge. And LeVar Burton is also the reason why my first book was published, Modern Herstory.
Oh, really?
He shouted me out on Twitter. He said, well, okay, so let me back it up. Since we're here, we have time.
Yeah.
I learned how to read from reading Rainbow. I struggled with reading, which is really wild that I'm now an author, because I couldn't read really well until I was like in 3rd grade. And even then I had a lot of struggles with it. I would memorize the books and repeat them out loud at school. But I had, I just basically had like that kind of dyslexic thing where it felt like the words were moving on the page. But with reading Rainbow, it gave me like this love of reading. And I was born in 93. So reading Rainbow, I think it was slightly before my time, but I would always watch the reruns. And I just love LeVar Burton also because he was Kunta Kinte, big part of my life, basically.
Oh, yeah.
And so I was like, one day I want to thank at LeVar Burton for, teaching me how to read. And then he was like, you just did, Blair, but you don't have to take my word for it. To which I hyperventilated and cried ugly for like 2 hours because I was just so full of joy that like, wow. I tagged him, so of course he's going to see it. And I think I was verified by that point on Twitter. Anyway, flash forward a couple months, I'm trying to get my book published. And LeVar Burton has 2 million followers at that time who are specifically in publishing. And he retweeted my post. And unfortunately, I'm not on Twitter anymore because it's a hell site. But he retweeted my post and he said, somebody published this woman's book. Wow. And I got so many inquiries. People were asking me for my book proposal. People were asking me for the next steps. I didn't know what a book proposal was. I didn't know what a book agent was, but I have a lot of good friends, so they helped me figure it out. But I wouldn't be published without LeVar Burton because I was convinced I would have to self-publish, and I got so many inquiries from different publishers. It opened the doors for me meeting with Penguin Random House and eventually signing with 10 Speed Press and getting my book deal through them, and now I'm on my 3rd book with them.
Wow, that is fantastic. And tell me the name of that first book again, because I think I talked over you a little bit.
Oh, no, sorry, I'm terrible at self-promotion. It's called Modern Herstory, Stories of Women and Non-Binary People Rewriting History. And then my second book with them was Making Our Way Home, The Great Migration and the Black American Dream, in which LeVar Burton is prominently featured when he was on the cover of Time magazine around Roots.
Nice. Very cool. Very cool. Well, and you had another encounter with LeVar with your cosplay.
Yes, I did. And I actually had never met him until I went to Star Trek Las Vegas for kind of the express purpose of meeting LeVar Burton. Nice. And also being able to connect with the fans because people were recognizing me. I think the Today Show had done a piece on me. Now This had done a piece on me. And my friend Ren and I, we were just chilling, having a great time. I did a Guinan cosplay and it was just such a great time. And then we went over to the picture booth, to get pictures with the stars like you do. And LeVar Burton recognized me and introduced me to the rest of the fans that were there. It just felt like such an amazing moment. It just was definitely a highlight of that summer, which was honestly such a summer of pain. And it really made it one where I could kind of come away from it not being like, oh, this is the worst summer ever when my mentor was killed. But no, I got to meet one of my childhood heroes, and I got to really make a mark in the Star Trek world, which is a whole other conversation that maybe we should get into as well, how it was received by the community.
I would love to get into that. Yes, please.
Okay, so, where to start?
But I will say that the story so far is so great because I think, you're demonstrating something. We talk about mental health a lot on this show. Especially when we were going through this season of Discovery. It's just a topic that presents itself. And it's so important to our spiritual lives. It's so important to our physical lives, to every part of us. And you're talking about a way that Star Trek has been something that you used to work through, I mean, really huge mental and emotional health issues and really big struggles in your life. And then also just the way kindness from someone like LeVar. I mean, just that being kind to somebody else and supporting and encouraging them the way you would want to be supported and encouraged. I mean, what a great example. And
I mean, one tweet has resulted in 3 books so far. Like, that is wild.
Yeah.
You know?
Not to mention the tweet where he said yours was his favorite Geordi cosplay ever.
I'm going to get that framed. I think I have a screenshot of it. I'm going to get it framed. I have some framed tweets. I'm going to get that one framed because that was just so wild. And so, okay, so
Amazing.
LeVar Burton loved it. I mean, how much better can your cosplay be when the person who played the character and created that character says it's perfect? Like, you can't go anywhere else. Like,
that's it.
Even
You've arrived.
the guy who made my visor upped the prices like $100 and like use the testimony from LeVar Burton as a reason to do that. And I was like, oh man, you know, I should have bought more when it was, you know, down regular price.
Right.
But it was not universally well received. Certainly it was not. Certainly there were people who were saying there are no Muslims in space. There are no Muslims in Star Trek. To which I had to sadly inform them that Star Trek is not real. And they do not get to decide what is and what is not in a fictional universe, particularly when the thesis of that universe is infinite diversity in infinite combinations, which includes religious people, which includes non-Abrahamic religious people, which includes Muslims. And not only was that what I personally believed to be true, but I had evidence in the actual canon. And it was a really excellent lesson for me because the way I talk about religion so often is about us having our own personal interpretations. And this was an example of something that is far less consequential to our, you know, eternal souls, Star Trek, you know, being founded around our own personal interpretations. And there were people who were just going to bat for me immediately. People were like, Blair, there's no religion in Star Trek. Actually, did you see episode whatever in season this, in series that?
Right.
You know, the Bajorans, the
religion all over Star Trek.
There is. You cannot have humanity without religion. I mean, it is how we derive meaning, and that's not going to disappear just because we have some humanoid aliens, regardless of how intent on, you know, having this atheistic, secularist view of the future or the present some folks have. I think that it has to be a very important conversation for us to realize that for many people, myself and yourself included, religion isn't something that is, you know, default, but something that really helps us to understand ourselves and the world around us, and that includes our future.
Right, absolutely. And to think about human future, I mean, even if, like the spiritual impulse, the religious impulse, whatever you want to call it, is so intrinsic to us as human beings, which I think is an incredibly good argument for the existence of God, that we have an instinct for something because something is there for us. But it's so intrinsic to us that even if you have this air quotes secular future, right? Even if you have this scientific future, you are still engaged in the same project of the pursuit of meaning. That is what religion is all about, what religious impulse is all about.
And my favorite example of this is simulation theory. I love when I hear secular people talk about simulation theory, the idea that we're all living in a simulation and that some other world created us. I'm like, sounds like the Greek pantheon to me, but maybe I'm just too religious and superstitious, folks. But when I hear about this, it's like, okay, yeah, I mean, maybe God is a programmer and that we are living in a simulated future and we are not aware of the fact that we're in a simulation. We'll just swap out those things with angels and programmers, and you arrive at the same conclusion. It is an inevitability that as humans, we imagine what came before us, what will come after us, which is the basis of sci-fi. And that itself I find to be a religious endeavor. But of course I'm biased because I'm very comfortable with that. But what it also taught me, this cosplay, is that a lot of people have trauma related to religion. And that is why they refuse to make space for religious people. And as somebody who also has trauma around religion, even my own faith of Islam, I converted to Islam in 2015. I was raised Christian. I still have trauma related to that, but I also have enough wisdom and enough discernment to be able to create space for people who do find meaning within that, even as I work through my own traumas.
I would love to talk to you about that, because one of the things that we are constantly bumping up against in this show, just as a natural outgrowth of who we are and how we're processing our faith. And we talked a good bit about this with Sue on last episode, is this push and pull between this impulse, or this faith that we have, or that we try to cultivate, this faith life that we try to live, and these religious structures that can be so hostile to us. Not just hostile to those outside, but hostile to those inside. And a lot of us are sort of struggling with trying to sort of rescue our faith from our faith that is rooted in our religious background. But then we also feel like we have to kind of rescue our faith from our religious background at the same time.
Oh, yes.
And from our religious present, too.
I think that the most important thing I can tell anyone is that no one can take God away from you.
Yes,
and
ma'am.
I truly believe in this democratized, personal, one-to-one relationship with God or gods. And that's something that can be taken away. And I think that, my mom, she's very much not super secularist, but certainly a little bit, and believes that she believes that religious infrastructures are just tools of control. And the unfortunate truth is that human institutions run the risk of being tainted by human hands, by human hearts, by human motivations, for positive ends, but often for negative ends. I mean, the amount of war that has been, perpetrated in the name of gods or God, the amount of violence that has been done. And sometimes when we consider those things, we fail to recognize the amount of good that has been done. And I think that even when it comes to fandom, to really take it away from this, religious space for a moment, think about fandoms. Think about things like Gamergate. Think about the ways that, women cosplayers are really treated horribly with sexism, with malice in, fandom spaces. Does that mean that we stop having fandoms? Absolutely not. Does it mean that we treat this with responsibility and that we look inward for how we're contributing to sexist structures? Yes. But I think that when it's something that is so disconnected from something as massively important as where our souls end up, if they end up anywhere, it's much harder to lean into those things and think about those objectively and think about the harms and the benefits and how we're contributing. Because when it comes to God, when it comes to religion, it is far beyond our favorite show. It is far beyond what we enjoy seeing. It is what we know to be true. And, sociologists and psychologists have found consistently and conclusively that when we have our ideas challenged, it is the same part of the brain that triggers when we feel that we ourselves are being challenged. So if I'm attacking you and I'm saying, I hate you, I can't stand you, that hurts just as much as me saying what you believe to be true is not. And if it's something as grand and abstract and important as God and faith and these abstract things, then the propensity for that feeling of attack is much higher. And then we revert to these kind of defensive natures, just like we would if somebody said they were challenging our knowledge of, Spock's lore or Geordi LaForge, where he was born and at what time. No, I know that to be true. I'm in charge of this. I know about this. But it's the stakes. And honestly, I would not have had that analysis had I not seen the way that people so viscerally responded to my cosplay, because I was not able to examine the role of our identity formation as it relates to these stories that we find meaning in.
Yeah, I had a similar experience when I started promoting my first Gospel According to Star Trek book on random Star Trek Facebook groups and things that would allow me to do that. I could immediately sometimes get blowback from people, similar to what you got, about how there's no religion in Star Trek. But I found that if I did not then respond to them in a defensive or a spiteful manner, but just sort of explain to them, what I'm doing and why I'm doing it, and that, I'm not trying to say there's some, intentional secret Christian agenda behind Star Trek, just finding corollaries, and that there's infinite diversity and all those sorts of things. Once I started to have those conversations, people would go, oh, okay, hey, that's cool.
So the great thing for me was that I posted this as we were getting ready, Ren and I, getting ready to go down to San Diego. So I posted it. So I didn't even see all of the turmoil online. I just saw oh great, LeVar Burton thought it was cool, amazing, and I didn't even see that. My friends were texting me because they were all geeking out about it. But I didn't even see that in the comments in real time. I find that when you're a couple hours removed from a crisis, it feels a lot easier to deal with.
Yes.
And so I didn't even see any of this. I was making that 3-hour drive down to San Diego, just having a grand old time singing all these songs. And by the time we got to the hotel, we were checking in, having lunch, doing all that types of fun stuff. And I didn't even see it till basically after Comic-Con weekend, all of this banter back and forth of people being so angry. All I saw was people high-fiving me at Comic-Con. Nobody in person had anything negative to say. There were a few people who were just being jerks, but not more than what you might expect just going into any space where there's lots of people, which sounds so ridiculous since we're living in a panorama. And so it was just so wild. And then when I looked online, when I had a moment of quiet, I was seeing people already defending me. And so I didn't even have to do that work of explaining what my point was. I had people saying no, we're going to protect her. She deserves to be here. Take your Islamophobia elsewhere. If you want to hate on Muslims, don't bring Star Trek into this. Right. And then to see the Roddenberry Foundation, to see StarTrek.com really stand by me. It wasn't my goal to completely disrupt the conversation around religion and Star Trek. That's what I ended up doing. But I already had people having my back, which is why I love Star Trek so much, because the people in this fandom, we grew up seeing infinite diversity and infinite combinations and lessons about diversity and compassion and love and, yes, religion and faith and God, and being, acclimated to that. And then we went on to be in all types of different fields. And when it's time to stand up for each other, we do it without, apprehension.
Yeah. And that is a beautiful thing that I wish our religious communities would harness more frequently.
Ooh, yeah.
And I was on a podcast back when all this first started, back when it was the Undiscovered Country Project. And I was rattling off this line that I had at the time where I said, I'm not trying to make Star Trek a Christian thing. I'm not trying to make Christianity a Star Trek thing. And one of the hosts of the podcast said, well, I think Christianity could do with being a little more Star Trek. Christianity could use could do well to become more of a Star Trek thing. And I was like, excellent point. I'm not going to say that again. Because it's true.
Honestly, however you can understand it. I gave a talk at Princeton with their theological department. And I was talking about Star Trek and headcanon, and I was using all these nerd terms to talk about religion with PhDs in theology, and they were all vibing. They were all listening. Oh, yeah. They were all feeling like I was approaching it in ways that were innovative and new. But it's all stories, right? Yes. Some stories are older than others. Some have meaning in ways that others don't. But we can accomplish it in various ways. And there are limitations to these storytelling methods, whether they are through religious texts, whether they are through, visual, whether it's, a reboot, whether it's, a typecast, whether it's a cosplay. And they all have meaning. And I think that's just so beautiful, and really leaning into that and embracing it for what it is, whether or not we, align ourselves with it. Sometimes it's beautiful, especially within religion, to kind of look across at a different faith, a different practice, and just say, wow, that means so much to them. That's beautiful. And to stop short of being no, that's wrong. I think that is the aspect that all fandoms, religious and otherwise, could do well to have.
Yeah, something that we had Natalie Atwell on at the beginning of this month, of Women's Future History Month. She's the wife of one of our co-hosts, David Atwell. And I brought her in because I was constantly hearing through David all these brilliant things that she was saying. And I was like, she should come on the show. And so we finally got her in with the Women's Future History thing. But one thing that she had said in the past that David had passed along to me was, she said, how can you love your neighbor if you're not willing to listen to their story? And I thought, man, that is so great. And I think that's so much of what we need to do more of. And why I love having these dialogues, having these conversations, coming to Star Trek as a Christian, putting my faith in conversation with Star Trek, finding all these great corollaries. We're going to be talking about some interesting stuff in the coming weeks in that regard. But that has been so great for me. It has deepened and grown my faith and helped me through some really hard times and struggles, but not quite like what you went through, but in the similar way that it can be beneficial to us. And one of the great things that I've enjoyed is talking with people who have different faiths and different philosophies, and talking about how they identify with Star Trek, because it does a few things. I mean, one is, it gives us this common reference point so we can see through another person's eyes, and we can learn a little bit about that person. We can listen to their story, and then also we can find things that we have in common that we might not otherwise find. And that's a great thing that something like Star Trek does, brings so many diverse people together. So that sort of is a nice segue to the thing that really intrigued me about what you said, because you were here because of Women in Warp. I heard you on Women at Warp.
Oh, yeah.
And I was like, I gotta have this person on my show. But we barely had a show at the time. We still barely have a show. But
all in due time.
We're getting there. This is episode 31. So yeah, all right. But we are... but you talked about that you see your Muslim faith reflected in Star Trek. And as soon as I hear somebody say something like that, I immediately want to talk to them. So I'm just going to hand that over to you and say, run with that. Tell me all about where you see your Muslim faith reflected in Star Trek, because I've wanted to hear it for months.
Thank you. I think it's so many different places. I think one of the first things is honestly around the Prime Directive, which is an unsung aspect of Star Trek that I really admire, like non-interference. And I think that in Islam, it's kind of this trying not to judge, like trying not to interfere, trying not to judge. But like, again, going back to the episode Symbiosis, like Picard doesn't fix their ship and allow them to continue the harm of selling drugs to each other and, perpetuating the addiction. But he doesn't fix it either. And so I think in Islam, sometimes there is evangelizing in Islam is really looked down upon, which is unique, I think, from my religious background, having a Christian religious background, because evangelizing, that's like the whole thing. I'm like, asking people who clearly have heard of Jesus if you've heard of Jesus is like part of the big thing. We have Christmas. It's a bank holiday, but have you heard of Christ? Like, it's,
right.
A little tedious. And so in Islam, if you kind of think about it, like there's not a lot of mission trips. There's not a lot of, enforcing our culture onto other people. Of course, it's not a perfect example. We see this a lot, especially in like Islamic majority countries. But that's a lot about governments and power and politics. But as far as like kind of leaving people to themselves, not in a way that we're perpetuating harm, but in a way that we're not imposing our own understandings onto other people. When I was converting to Islam, my friends were so cautious to inform me of their interpretations. They would always be like, no, you read that passage, and if you need help, I'll point you to resources, but I'm not going to make this decision for you. And it was such a hands-off approach. And I feel like that is what I have almost experienced universally with my friends who've either converted or have helped folks, through that process of coming to an understanding, is very much that like, no, this is between you and God. This is between you and your own personal journey. And that's one of the biggest ways I see it reflected. There's also the other way I see it reflected, which is fashion. I mean, so many shows. Like if we look at Guinan, if we look at the gala and all different aspects of the ways that, Star Trek is such a fashion forward show. I mean, one of the interesting things was around the short skirts and how those were kind of done away with the Next Generation. That's an interesting aspect. Oh, Star Trek is super into modesty. Sounds a little bit Islamic to me. There's so many different ways.
Well, and to your point about the Prime Directive, I think it's interesting talking about evangelism, because I think, I grew up in the evangelical subculture, and that form of evangelism was very much the norm. But I don't think a lot of people realize how much that is a sort of cultural invention, and that I see a lot more Christians now moving to more of the mindset that you're talking about, which is, hey, I'm going to be honest about what I believe. I'm going to tell you things if you're interested, but I'm not here to try to hard sell you.
Exactly. And I've seen this with Mormons. Like, for example, I've noticed in anti-racist Mormon frameworks, there has been a push against going into neighborhoods. And, one, it's not safe because of COVID, but also instead of doing the door knocking and pushing literature onto people, just doing good works. And this has been kind of like a long going shift that's been more emphasized of late. But like, no, we're just going to mow your lawn. We're just going to do good works for you. We're not going to kind of beat you over the head with our stories. Instead, what we're going to do is try to lead by example. And I think that it's been happening kind of in like more widespread Christian spaces as well, which is really positive, because when you ask somebody this kind of false question as an invitation to a conversation, it assumes that that person already doesn't know something and that you're there to teach, and that person is there to learn only. And that's another aspect of Star Trek as well, is the way that, yes, there's a hierarchy, but if somebody is lower ranking and has a better solution, you better believe that the person with the better solution is going to be prioritized. Like, that's just a positive lesson, regardless of the religious aspect of it. But I think that, kind of decolonizing religion requires us to remember that, yes, this has been used as a tool for colonization, but colonization is not the end goal.
Right. And that's such a difficult thing. I think that's something that a lot of us who are sort of going through this, what I call post-evangelical transition period right now are really dealing with, and what a lot of people deal with who, we see the rise of what journalists call the nuns, which I really hate that, but the idea of people just sort of abandoning religious distinctions altogether. And a lot of those people are leaving Christianity because it's really hard to separate out these religious structures and, like you say, colonizing structures from like the faith that we talked about this. I've talked about this before on the show, but in the book I used Return of the Archons as the sort of archetypal example of Star Trek, original Star Trek discussing religion, where there's this system put in place that's supposed to preserve the teachings of Landru, but what it really does is kill the soul of the people.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be a hard thing to extricate those ideas from one another. And I think that's and it's interesting to see that that's happening across a religious spectrum right now.
Yeah, I think people in many ways, not just in religious context, but in governmental contexts, are really interrogating and reflecting on the things that don't work for us.
Yes.
And figuring out why they don't work for us. And one thing that's like really interesting about Star Trek is the ways, I think, particularly around the protests of 2020 during the summer, there was a big conversation that was happening. I think it was on like Reddit about how the, Starfleet is itself kind of an imperialist force. And I felt like that was such a one-dimensional look into it because, yes, of course, it's a tool of imperialism. There's no shying away from that. But it's also like science and exploration. And I think the aspect of the Prime Directive being built into that framework is, and I'm honestly such a big fan of The Next Generation. That's really where I live in terms of my Star Trek fandom. Although I try to respect the other belief systems as well. I mean, the other series. And I think that aspect is something that we must have. Because, look about like the United States. Like the United States itself is kind of a religion. And we do treat ourselves like this benevolent, always good, never having any qualms or issues force that is there to fix things, to sell democracy or protect democracy through war and drone strikes. And I think if we considered the Prime Directive more often, or made it real, instead of just being in this sci-fi space, we would be better off because we would be considering preserving the way that people live, because we have this big egotism in many regards as humans that what we know to be true is the best and only truth. And that's not true. And it requires us to step back and remove our egos from these conversations and try to derive positivity, meaning, and understanding from those that we think we are the only ones there to teach.
That reminds me of something that I read recently on your Instagram. I don't know what you say it. You posted an image of this artful text that said "Learning is a blessing," and you were talking about the humility that's required in learning, and also in teaching.
Oh, sure. I mean, I feel like that is a line that would come out of like, I don't know, Deanna Troi, perhaps. Just this idea that learning is a blessing. And the truth is that learning is so vulnerable. I think that we kind of hyper focus on how exciting it is to learn or how much learning is mandatory. But like once you get out of primary school, you're kind of done with learning. You're like, okay, all I do is take standardized tests. I'm exhausted. And a lot of the young people that I teach are in that boat. But when we think about learning as a vulnerable experience where you're opening your mind and your soul up to new understandings and perspectives, not necessarily changing your mind, but certainly the things that you consider when making up your mind, then it becomes a spiritual experience in itself, because you're letting me into your life, into your ears, via this podcast perhaps, and, allowing my perspectives to inform yours. And that's a moment that I really hold sacred. And so when I say learning is a blessing, it helps me in those moments where I just want to say, like, just go read the syllabus, just go look at the class rules, and I can really just say, okay, well, we're going through this experience together. How can I make it easier? How can I make it more meaningful? How can I bring it forward in a way that honors both of our shared experiences and the experience that we're creating together in this learning context? And I think, like, that is a message that we see throughout just the character development across Star Trek, properties, is this idea of, like, you can only teach somebody as much as they're willing to learn themselves.
Yeah.
And sometimes it is the result of people trying and failing, and eventually getting it right. Or sometimes never getting it right because this character arc isn't fully completed, Geordi. But I think that whole aspect of, like, learning being a blessing and us needing to sort through our fatal flaws, and that being a blessing, and that not being something that's a burden or difficult, but something that's really exciting. I mean, the science message and the knowledge-seeking aspects of Star Trek are just things that I think, are things that really stick with you with or without a religious context behind it.
Absolutely. And I think and all of that, though, is not separate from our religious lives, from our spiritual lives. Like you were saying, one of the things that I derived from my mentor that sort of sent me on the journey that I'm on is that intellectual pursuits, sitting in college class, having, expected to never sit in a classroom again, just going to get a degree to hang on the wall to get a better job. In that philosophy class, the thing that I learned was that my intellectual pursuits were necessarily spiritual pursuits. That education isn't just about, earning that degree. Education is about who I become as a human being. And who I become as a human being is directly bound up in who God is calling me to be and the formation of my soul. It's like David Gerald says all the time that the final frontier is not space. The final frontier is the human soul. Space is just a place where we meet the challenge.
Absolutely. I love that. And I think what's really interesting is, let me take a deep cut really quick.
Please.
So Gil Scott-Heron has a poem called Whitey on the Moon. And Gil Scott-Heron is a Black radical poet. And he really wrote and sang about so many different things impacting the Black community. The phrase, "the revolution will not be televised," is from him. So he has one of these more tongue-in-cheek aspects called Whitey on the Moon. He was all about really trying to push buttons and get folks to really react. And what it is at its core is about the systemic and racial inequality that affects Black people, while primarily white men go into space. Right. And what I think is interesting with Star Trek is that one challenges that reality by placing all types of people in the future and in space. But it also reminds me of what was going on during the uprisings of 2020 when, I think it was Elon Musk was bringing folks into space with a somewhat diverse crew. But also while the social injustice was happening. And we can go back to 1969 when the, space missions were happening, while also Stonewall was happening, while the Black Panther Party was happening, while the Civil Rights Movement is starting to transform into the Black Power movement. And so I think, like, as far as what space is being the place that we get there, it's also about thinking about who gets there. And Star Trek allows us to imagine it. But also, one thing that I've been discussing, ad nauseum, is this idea of how we get there. And it requires us to not only go around and point out those things that are harmful, but to look inward into our souls and examine how we're contributing to those harms.
Right.
And I think that that's the harder work, but it's the more necessary work, because I could have left that cosplay by feeling like, oh man, all these people are Islamophobic, these people just hate Muslims. But instead, I decided to approach it from, okay, how did they arrive at this conclusion? And how can I either connect with them and start to resolve it or move forward toward a better understanding? But that takes me looking into myself and going, why am I defensive?
Yeah.
because I feel personally attacked. Why do I feel personally attacked? That person isn't attacking me. That person's attacking an idea that I represent to them. And if you can depersonalize it that way, then you can get to that point where we do have this, kind of rainbow solidarity connection in space. But we're not going to get to infinite diversity in infinite combinations unless we can look inward at ourselves and work through our souls, because that is the final frontier. Many human exploits and pursuits have been all about distracting ourselves from looking inward. But sometimes we need to go into our own personal holodeck and work through our own crises.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And I think it's so important and that ties into what you're talking about, the humility of learning too. And I've so frequently felt, and I tried to do this a little bit also in the first book, was to try to, as best I can, hold up a mirror to Christian culture and say, how are we, yes, it's really easy to get sort of a victim mentality or what am I trying to say? A persecution complex, right? A lot of Christians seem to have that. I know people of a lot of groups have that sense. And, a lot of times they're not wrong that people are saying bad things about them or doing bad things against them. But then you also have to look and say, all right, but how is this culture earning that? What if some of what they say is right? How are we not living up to what we're called to do and who we're called to be? And that can be a very difficult conversation to have because, like you're saying, it is so personal for us. And how do you get over that? How do you get over that hurdle? Because I think there's that you have to separate a little bit. How do you disentangle that? The way I asked it to Sue last time was, how do you own your faith when your religion wants to disown you?
Ooh, yes. Well, I think one of the things is to look at relative privilege and relative power. We all have privilege relative to someone else. Mm-hmm. And it's not about measuring that stick and doing the whole oppression Olympics and figuring out who's the most harmed, but figuring that while we are harmed, someone else is further harmed, which gives us perspective. And simultaneously, how am I contributing or benefiting from that harm to them? Which is intersectionality at its fundamental core, is looking at people as they are and the systems of oppression that they are connected to, but not just oppression, but also privilege, because oppression benefits a few people and harms a lot more. And so we have to think about that multidimensionally. But when it comes to somebody having an issue with me or something I've done or a lesson I've posted, I have to take a step back. Of course, I'm going to feel personally attacked, and not all critiques come in the best packages or the most respectful ones. But as an educator, I have to derive meaning, Is it that this person just hates everything that I'm talking about? Is it that this person was a little bit of a jerk and maybe has some valid points? And what it requires is remembering that oftentimes people are not attacking me. They're attacking what they think I represent. And only God knows our souls. In Islam, we say only Allah knows our intentions. And that is in so many aspects. Sometimes you can definitely, smell a rat when somebody's really being false with you. We have very good intuition as human beings. Right. But sometimes it's that we are letting our own baggage inform what that person's communicating to us. So what I've decided to start doing is assume positive intention, which is kind of what Data does, because Data's a robot. But anytime somebody comes at Data sideways, even when somebody was totally trying to depersonalize Data and say that you're just a robot automaton, Data's just well, actually, let me explain it to you. Well, actually, let me explain it to you. And it's it requires this kind of SpongeBob-ish cheerfulness sometimes, but just this rubber, you're rubber, I'm glue type, or you're I'm rubber, you're glue, that type of thing, where you have to assume positive intention and remember that if somebody is coming at you in a way that is not true to who you are, then it's probably not about you, particularly if they don't know who you are. And simultaneously, if we consider relative privilege, it may be that it's because we represent something that is harmful to them. So right now there's a big conversation around not all men. But we have to be able to parse through when people are using men, but mean the patriarchy, and when they're actually talking about all men being horrible. Right. And we have to do that as religious people as well. There's a lot of trauma that has been done in the name of what we believe. and sometimes in the name, but not in the truth. And so I think as a queer Muslim, I remember that because there has been so many people who have been harmed by a homophobic interpretation of God, I have to remember that it's not about my personal beliefs. It's about what those beliefs might represent to somebody else. And I have to be mindful of how I might inspire trauma or pain in them, whether or not that's my desire or my goal. But it is sometimes my responsibility to mitigate that to the best that I can, because sometimes that's the work we have to do as well.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And I think that's honestly, that is again a form of neighbor love, of considering the effect of your actions. And then also what you were talking about earlier about really looking at how you might be furthering harm to others. You know, it reminds me very much of, you were reminding me very much of Jesus' words to take the speck out of your own eye so you can see clearly, or take the plank out of your own eye so you can see clearly, to take the speck out of your sibling's eye. And I think that's so important, that inner work, because if we're not clear about what we're doing, not just what we're doing and why we're doing it, because I think a lot of people will sort of will plead their intentions as a matter of pride without actually recognizing that their whatever their intentions are, their actions are harming someone else, and they need to take someone's word for it that those actions are harmful, and they need to respond accordingly, even if that's difficult, even if that creates cognitive dissonance, even if that requires a humility that is difficult to swallow, to go with.
Oh, absolutely. I actually just did a lesson on apologies recently.
Nice.
And I think when I think
I
about
think I
Star
saw
Trek,
that. I think I saw that.
Yeah, my little lesson on apologies. But when I think about Star Trek, there are so many different cultural and species backgrounds. People are going to be apologizing all the time. It's going to be straight up Canada in there. No offense to Canada. But it's like, there's just going to be times when you gawk at maybe somebody's, facial features, is particularly thinking about, you might, stare at Worf's facial grooves too hard or something. Like,
right.
You're going to have to say you're sorry. And it's going to be because you're seeing this species for the first time ever, because that's what's going to happen in those 300 years between now and Star Trek. And so it requires humility. And the thing is, and I tell this to my younger students, if you intend to prank somebody and you end up burning their house down, it really doesn't matter that it was a prank. It really matters that you burnt their house down. And you have to figure out how you're going to try to make that better. Now, that's an extreme example, but it could be that you tried to speak up on behalf of a community and it was the exact wrong thing, or the community didn't appreciate it or didn't need it, but you might have been so caught up in speaking up that you forgot to be present. And so being present is reflecting and saying, do I need to be the one to say it? Now that I have said it, now that I have messed up, isn't it better just to admit that and to try to share that understanding? And so it's funny, though, because apology comes from the Greek, I believe, apologia, which is a form of speech, which is literally about denying accountability and justifying all of your bad actions. And it's funny that apologies have come to mean taking accountability. But accountability is just, hey, I'm taking responsibility for this. I'm not going to waste time telling you why I got to this end goal, but I am going to convey that I understand that this hurt you or disappointed you or harmed you, and I will do better in the future. And sometimes it's not about being forgiven. It's just about demonstrating that you understand so that you can do better, because we have to stop apologizing to be forgiven. We have to start apologizing because it's what our soul needs for us to be able to move forward in meaningful and intentional ways.
And that you've touched on things there that do have such relevance. I'm thinking about the concepts of humility and repentance, and the humility that is required for repentance, and that you repent of something not to get rewarded with forgiveness. You repent of something because you need to start doing the right thing, because it's the right thing to do, not because you're afraid of some consequence or you want to make something better for yourself. It needs to be pure. It always has to be about doing the right thing for the right thing's sake. You said something actually on Instagram a while back. You said, I'm paraphrasing here. You said, I'm going to stop worrying, or I have stopped worrying about what other Muslims think of me, and I'm only going to be concerned with what Allah thinks of me.
I mean, absolutely. That helped me with so many things, like alcoholism. I have alcohol use disorder. And I was like, oh man, I'm a queer Muslim. I have tattoos. I have dogs. and alcohol use disorder. And I don't know why I was so convinced that that was going to be the one thing that made people stop respecting me. It's like, if you got through any of those other things and alcohol use disorder was what, I don't even want to be around you. But I had to really be upfront with myself that, like, God knows all my sins and God decides my soul's fate.
Yeah.
I cannot be caught up with what people who follow me on Instagram think when those people, in Islam, there's this beautiful surah about you could be that person's neighbor. You could have lived every moment of life with them. But when it comes to Judgment Day, you will not see what they go through because you do not see their soul. And it's just a reminder that, like, while we do share this life together, we are responsible for our own sins. And so, and we are also responsible for the harms that we do to others. And it's not about, forget everybody, I'm not going to be in community anymore. But I'm going to stop living for other people in the way that I'm living my life because it's somebody else's dream. I'm going to try to live my dreams, be in service to other people, but not let the decisions and whims and prejudices of other people define who I decide to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's really true. And I thought that was such a beautiful idea when you shared that, because I think we do spend our lives, and this is another sort of fallout of conflating religion with God, We do get so caught up in how other people view us and whether or not they approve of us. And we almost make that, we do basically transmorph that into God's approval. But only
all the time.
But only God is God.
Yeah.
So.
And that's a beautiful thing, because when people come at me and they say things like, Blair, you're going to hell, I'm like, wait, I'm sorry, I forgot. Does Allah have Instagram? I don't think so. Well, I hope that you work through whatever crisis you're having that makes you feel like you need to displace all your trauma onto others. Now, I don't respond like that as much now. I just kind of move on. But it's just remembering that we are not here to be receptacles for other people's trauma. We are here to do great and beautiful things with infinite diversity and infinite combinations. And going through the judgments of others who are not helping us get there is not the point, I don't believe.
Yeah, I think that's right. Well, Blair, this has been a fascinating conversation, tightly scripted, as it always is around here. I want to thank you so much for your time and coming on the show. Please tell people where they can find you if they want to learn more about what you're doing in the world.
Well, I'm very easy to find nowadays. My SEO results are way up there. You can find me on Instagram at Blair Imani. I'm on TikTok against my will because I'm an influencer now. And I have a series on YouTube that I would love for folks to subscribe to. It's called Get Smarter with Blair Imani. And we're doing a bunch of different lessons on neurodiversity. We have some lessons going on about autism and ableism, awesome. Which are really important. And just really trying to get at the fact that, like, there's just so much to see and learn. And I'm just also trying to live out my dreams of being LeVar Burton in all his iterations.
That's beautiful. I'm looking forward to the day when we can have Geordi's garage and LeVar can be telling us, now here, this conduit, you want to connect this. Get your hyperspanner.
Indeed.
Oh, thank you so much for being here, Blair. It has been a wonderful conversation, and appreciate you greatly, and live long and prosper.
Live long and prosper. Thank you so much for having me, Kevin.
Well, this has been a wonderful finale for our Women's Future History Month. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. Next week, we're going to get back to basics. We're going to talk about something that's actually in my first book, but maybe in some ways that are not in the book. We're going to be discussing Spock as a Christ figure. Mike Poteet will be joining me for that episode. It's going to be really exciting. Hope you enjoy it. Please join us. And in the meantime, please like, share, comment, rate, and subscribe. And also be sure to send us your questions. Gospel According to Star Trek on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram, or gospeltrekpodcast@gmail.com. We would love to discuss your question on the show. Also, you can support us on Patreon at patreon.com/gospeltrekpodcast. We have some really cool perks available for patrons because we appreciate your support so much. It helps keep the show going. That's going to wrap it up for this edition of the Gospel According to Star Trek podcast. Thank you so much for being here. And until next time, I'm Kevin Senes. My guest has been Blair Imani. And as Jesus said in John 10:10, live long and prosper. See you next time.